All right, well, I was going to, before we got into our content, I was going to do a fast prophecy update. This is a quote from Charles Feinberg, who wrote this in 1950 concerning the book of Zechariah. It's prescient what he says. Anything you can get from him,
Yeah, it's great.
get it, particularly his Zechariah commentary. He was kind of a big wheel at Talbot Seminary on the campus of Biola University. All the
Back in the day.
buildings there are named after him. Real Hebrew scholar, but he says this. He says the last section of the latter part of Zechariah, that's Zechariah 12 through 14, deals with events in the distant future. As a portion of the prophetic scriptures, it is second to none in importance. In this book, or any other Old Testament book, it is indispensable to an understanding of the events of the last days of Israel, the time of the Great Tribulation, and the establishment of God's kingdom on the earth. And then he says this, in the time of our passage, all the nations of the earth will be bitten by the virus of antisemitism.
Interesting.
So God's word predicts that the nations would develop a irrational hatred for the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as we move to the end times. So even the late great United States of America, it's sad to report, we have people there that are just openly anti-Semitic. It used to be statements like this came from kooky professors and kooky websites. This is from Rashida Tlaib, member of the House of Representatives, based on what just happened in Israel the last couple days. This headline says, Tlaib denounces violent reality of Israeli apartheid, but fails to condemn Hamas. So everything that's happened in her mind over the last couple of days concerning Israel is obviously Israel's fault. Now, concerning this international movement into anti-Semitism, it's really the prophet Ezekiel in chapters 38 and 39 that really fills in the details. This is a map that I use frequently related to Ezekiel's prophecy, yet future, of the nations that will invade Israel in the last days. And you have to understand something, that Ezekiel saw this vision 2,600 years ago. And obviously when Ezekiel saw this vision, it made no sense to him. And the truth of the matter is, until our general time period, this map would have made no sense.
Okay.
First of all, it talks about an invasion of Israel. Well, there wasn't even an Israel to invade prior to 1948. It talks about Rosh or Russia coming down from the north against Israel. That made no sense prior to 1917, because prior to 1917, Russia was a Christian Orthodox country.
That's right.
And wasn't interested in invading anybody. Of course, everything changed in Russia. 1917 with the Communist Revolution. And then it also talks about Turkey invading Israel. Well, you go back a few years and Israelis took their vacations in Turkey. I mean, Turkey wasn't going to invade anybody. And then it talks about Persia, which we believe is Iran, invading Israel. I mean, think what Ezekiel thought of that. That made no sense, because Persia was the good guy. Persia would be the nation that God would use to bring the Jews out of the 70-year captivity. And prior to 1979, Persia, or Iran, was an ally of Israel. It was one of the first to acknowledge the reborn state of Israel in 1948. Persia was an ally of the West. But you remember what happened in 1979
Ayatollah.
when the Shah was deposed and replaced by the Ayatollah. Remember during the days of Jimmy Carter and the long gas lines, and all of a sudden everything shifted, and Persia or Iran became Islamicized, an Islamic theocracy. If you go back into the 1970s, this map made no sense because you'll notice that Egypt is not attacking anyone in this map. Jordan is not attacking anyone in this map. And yet Egypt and Jordan particularly Egypt, were the principal adversaries of Israel beginning in 1948. But everything changed. Egypt and Jordan now have peace treaties with the nation of Israel. So my point is, as bizarre as a map like this looks, as strange as Ezekiel's prophecy looked, even in modern times, if you give history enough time, it catches up to what God said would happen. Because God knows the end from the beginning, and the beginning from the end. And things that look irrational and bizarre, God ultimately will be vindicated, because he cannot lie. So what has happened within the last few days is not a fulfillment of this prophecy, but certainly what's happened over the last few days, with the involvement of Turkey, Russia, Iran, in these latest attacks against Israel, Hamas being sort of a proxy of the big three, I believe. You can see how the whole scenario that Ezekiel saw 2,600 years ago is now extremely credible.
Yeah.
The centerpiece of everything is Israel. If you don't have a reborn Israel in the land, the prophetic scenario makes no sense. Ezekiel 38 and verse 12 describes the invasion, prophesied invasion. It says to capture spoil, to seize plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places which are now inhabited, and against the people who are gathered from the nations, who have acquired cattle and goods, who live at the center of the world. The word for center there in Hebrew is the word for navel, or the belly button, which is in the center of the body. Just as the belly button is in the center of the body, as far as God is concerned, the whole end times program revolves around the nation of Israel. So if you want to understand what time it is from God's vantage point, you always look at Israel. All of these other nations coming into proper alignment against Israel, those all have to be understood secondarily in light of the super sign, which has happened in our generation, of the political rebirth of the nation of Israel in unbelief. God said it would happen. It's happening. God said the nations would move into a particular political alignment, and everything that God said would happen is happening. And as we get closer and closer to the ultimate fulfillment of Ezekiel 38 and 39, the picture is going to get clearer and clearer and clearer. We're just very privileged because, for whatever reason, God has allowed us to live at this particular time in history, to see these things come into existence. We just got out of Turkey, didn't we?
Yeah.
So let's talk Turkey here for a minute. This is a brand new tweet that came out. Erdogan, Turkish president, says, "America, stay away. We will defend Palestine, at any price."
Wow.
So these are the kinds of things that are being said. I know that when we were in Turkey, we had tour guides that taught us what I thought was a little bit of propaganda,
Just a little.
that America and Israel will always be allies. And I thought to myself, I wonder if the tour guides have ever read Ezekiel 38 and 39, because when you look at this map here, 4 names that Ezekiel mentions can be traced to modern-day Turkey.
Yeah.
I wish I had time to go into the details. I have a little book on this where I try to explain myself called The Middle East Meltdown, the coming Islamic invasion of Israel. No other nation is given 4 names, but Meshach, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah all represent modern-day Turkey. And so we knew that eventually Turkey would turn, just like we knew that Russia would turn, Iran would turn, etc., etc. Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 2. And look at this prophecy in light of everything we've seen on our TV screens concerning the abuse of women and children. That's what's hard to watch about all of this. The abuse of women and children. Actually, God said in the end time that would happen. And this is the prophecy, Zechariah 14, verse 2. I will gather some of the nations, doesn't say that, all the nations, against Jerusalem to battle. The city will be captured, the houses plundered. Look at this next line.
Wow.
The women ravished or violated. Isn't that what we've been seeing?
Yes, yeah.
Human rights violations. Half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. So
Wow.
it's just more evidence that the scenario that the Bible anticipates for the end times is very, very credible. I'm just talking to Bill about this. It's Charles Feinberg in 1950 had to accept these things by faith.
Yes, yes.
We don't even have to accept them by faith. All we have to do is have reading comprehension and the ability to watch the news, and you can clearly see God's end time program coming into sharp focus. So the name of the game right now is Gaza. You see it there on the southwestern portion of the Israeli map. That's, as you probably know, that was an area given by the Israelis to the so-called Palestinians in 2005 that gave up the land. That little strip there had one and only one election. They elected Hamas.
Yeah.
That became a beachhead for terrorist activity, rocket attacks, the likes of which we've seen the last several days. It's all coming from Gaza. It's largely financed, as you know, by Iran, the world's number one state sponsor of terrorism around the world, a nation that the United States just gave $6 billion with a B, $1 billion to. And then that lighter brown area is what is called the West Bank, which is a term I hate.
Yeah.
The Bible doesn't use the word West Bank. It uses the expression Judea and Samaria. And by the way, when you use the expression West Bank, you're using a word from the Jordanian perspective, because that territory is to the west of Jordan, but it's not an Israeli perspective, because Judea and Samaria is not in the west of Israel, but it's in the east of Israel. So a lot of the narrative battle that we're seeing is just definitions. We use words like Palestine, we use words like West Bank, and we don't even understand that when we use those terms, we're buying into politically loaded language. But that area, Judea and Samaria, is the whole name of the game in the international community. And essentially what they want is they want Israel to give up that territory and give it to the Palestinians. And supposedly that's going to bring peace to the region. This is a statement that just came out October 7th, 2023. And do the math. Just Google when did the Yom Kippur War in 1973 break out, when Israel was successful. It'll take you 50 years back to one day before the statement was released, October 6th. My point is, what has happened in Israel has been planned.
Yeah.
It's obviously been planned, but it's been planned exactly to the right date, 50 years to the day, to vindicate the so-called Palestinians concerning the defeat that they suffered at what's called the Yom Kippur War, beginning October the 6th, 2023. Yom Kippur War, October 6th, 1973. Thank you. So this is a statement from the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This just came out, and it shows you their thinking. It shows you why they launched this attack, 50 years to the date. I'm just going to read you a couple lines from this. It says, "We have repeatedly warned against the consequences of blocking the political horizon and failing to enable the Palestinian people to exercise their legitimate right to self-determination and to establish along their state." In other words, if you back up here and look at that map, we haven't gotten our two-state solution. The West Bank should be ours, Judea and Samaria should be ours, and we're not making enough progress. And so we're going to vindicate our cause 50 years to the date when Israel got a great victory back in 1973 at the so-called Yom Kippur War. Looking at that second paragraph, it says security, stability, and peace in our region can be attained by ending the Israeli occupation of the land of the state of Palestine. They don't even call it the land of Israel, they call it Palestine. With East Jerusalem as its capital on the 1967 lines, and recognizing the people's right to independence and sovereignty. So basically what they're saying is if Israel simply goes back to the pre-1967 lines, then we'll finally have peace in the area. 1967 deals with what is called the Six-Day War, where Israel, in a war of self-defense, got back all of Jerusalem, all of the so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Golan Heights, and basically what they're trying to argue is Israel has that territory illegitimately. Okay, Israel does not have that territory illegitimately. Let me make you aware of two sources. One is named Joan Peters, who wrote a book called Time Immemorial. She was a very liberal journalist. I think she passed away about 5 years ago, but she went over to Israel to investigate the so-called Palestinian claims to the land. She was going to write a tell-all book, explaining how Israel stole the land, and the more she actually researched the issue and looked into it, the more she said there are no Palestinian claims to the land. Israel has that land legitimately. The second source I'll direct you to is by a Canadian lawyer named Jacques Gauthier. He was a Canadian attorney, is a Canadian attorney. You can find all his lectures and published material online. He spent 20 years at the University of Geneva defending Israel's legal right to the land in a doctoral dissertation. And he had readers, if you've ever gone through the dissertation process, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, particularly when your readers are hostile. So he had to, working on his PhD in political science, so he had to dot every I, cross every T. He spent 20 years on this. It survived the dissertation process, and what he has produced is a work of academia which is unassailable, proving that what Israel has right now in terms of land, going back to United Nations declarations, going back to what's called the San Remo Conference,
League of Nations.
San Remo Conference, post World War I, what Israel has today is legally theirs. And his conclusion in this dissertation, and we've had him speak at our pre-trib meeting, I've heard him speak, very eloquent speaker. He says, you can think whatever you want about Israel. You can have whatever political opinion you want about the nation of Israel, pro-Israel, against Israel, but here's the one thing you can't say. You cannot say that Israel currently is doing anything illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And yet what's repeated over and over again over the airwaves is occupied territory.
Yeah.
And you keep hearing that word occupied, occupied, occupied. You hear it over and over again through international press. And you start to think, well, Israel must be doing something illegal. The truth of the matter is they're doing nothing illegal. All of the property that they currently possess, survives any legal analysis. So when these people are saying Israel, just go back to the pre-67 borders and there'll be peace in the region, indicating that Israel doesn't legitimately have those borders post-1967, according to the sources that I've tried to cite here, that's just untrue.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded in 1964.
Yeah.
3 years before they got those extended territories in what's called the 6-Day War. So let me just ask you a question. What were they trying to liberate in 1964? They weren't trying to liberate the post-1967 territories because Israel didn't have them. Israel's width at that time was probably less than 10 miles. And so this idea that just go back to the 1967 borders and everything will be happy is what it is it's propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And if you repeat a lie long enough, eventually it will be accepted. So what is this whole Palestinian state about? The thing to understand is the word Palestine is not found in the Bible. It was a term invented by Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century, who after AD 70 came into the land of Israel, and he wanted to pretend that the Jews were never in that land at all. He wanted to de-Judaize the land, very similar to what the Muslims want to do today. And so he came up with this idea of Palestine to mock the Jewish people, coming from the name derived from one of their ancient enemies called the Philistines. So he just said, we're going to call this area Palestine. And unfortunately that lingo has caught on. Very sadly, it even appears in some of your study Bibles that you might use.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll use the name Palestine. It's an unbiblical word.
Mm-hmm.
It's like using the word West Bank. It's loaded with anti-Semitic jargon. We throw it around without even realizing that we're using it. And it's an invented term. So here's my kind of analysis of what's happened over the last several decades. The Palestinian cause, and keep in mind the root of the whole thing is Islam. Islam controls that part of the world. As far as Islam is concerned, Jerusalem is their third holiest site. It's not their first holiest site or second holiest site. It's their third holiest site because their first two holiest sites are where? Mecca and Medina.
Yeah.
Jerusalem is their third holiest site, even though the word Jerusalem never appears a single time in the Quran.
No.
There's this reference to the furthest mosque, and they say, oh, that must be Jerusalem. It's where Muhammad ascended back to Allah on a steed, Anybody know the name of the steed?
Barak.
Barak. Can't
Oh,
make
that's
this.
right.
Can't make this stuff up.
Can't make this up.
And when you watch Muslims praying in the Temple Mount area, what you'll see is their rear ends
Yep.
are towards what we would call the Temple Mount,
Yep.
because they're facing Mecca and Medina.
Amen. That's right.
So what they basically are saying is Jerusalem is our third holiest site, and that's the whole basis for wanting that part of the world back under their control. It kind of, all of this kind of gets lost in the political dialogue, but that's really what's at work here. So what happened with Yasser Arafat, the former leader of the Palestinians, is he realized that he could not beat the Jews militarily. They lost the War of Independence, 1948. They lost again in 1967. They lost again in 1973. What's happening right now is they're trying to vindicate 50 years to the date what was lost in 1973. And so he realized that we're never going to beat the Jews militarily. And that's where the Soviets kind of brought him under their tutelage and said, what you have to do is you have to win the narrative war. You have to win the propaganda war. Because currently, world sympathy, or at least at the time of Israel's rebirth, rested with Israel because Israel was just emerging from the Holocaust. And the world felt sorry for Israel. The Jews, need a land of their own. And so world sympathy rested with Israel, and Yasser Arafat couldn't beat Israel politically. And so the Soviets said, you have to shift the narrative. You have to make it look as if Israel is the oppressor. You have to make it look as if Israel stole the land from another civilization. And that's how you'll shift world opinion against Israel. It's the same kind of logic that's used against the United States all of the time. It's called critical race theory. The United States is illegitimate because look at what we did with the slavery issue. Never commenting on the fact that we've amended our Constitution 3 times, to rectify what happened in the slavery era. But you just keep saying over and over again, America is an apartheid state, America is an apartheid state, and you'll shift world opinion against the United States of America. It's the same thing that's currently being done concerning the nation of Israel. And so what you have to do, as the Soviets were teaching Arafat, is you have to argue for a so-called Palestinian state within the borders of Israel. And once you get that, you'll be able to use it, just like Gaza, as a beachhead for further rocket attacks and military attacks against the nation of Israel. So what we've been seeing over the last several years is really just a propaganda war. Israel did not steal the land from an indigenous civilization called the Palestinians. The whole idea of the Palestinians is made up. There is no such thing as Palestinian currency. There's no such thing as Palestinian archaeology. Nobody can name the different leaders of Palestine, although you can do that with any other country. It's just one of the great myths of the Middle East. It's a narrative war. It's a propaganda war. And you just keep repeating the propaganda over and over and over again. And eventually world sympathy will move away from Israel. The world feels sorry for Israel already because of the Holocaust. You have to shift the narrative and you have to make it sound as if Israel is an oppressive apartheid state that stole the land from someone else. And once you get to that point, then you'll get your two-state solution. Once you get that, then you'll have a beachhead within the borders of Israel to launch, terrorist attack after terrorist attack against Israel. So this is really what these people want. Let me read to you the third paragraph, just one sentence. Second sentence, and this is them in their own words. This is not me making things up. They're telling us why they just did what they did. They said that is in addition to the absence of a solution to the Palestinian cause after 75 years of suffering. Now that number goes back to 1948. 75 years of suffering and displacement, the continuation of the policy of double standards, and the silence of the international community regarding the criminal and racist practices of Israeli occupation forces against the Palestinian people, and the continuation of injustice and oppression to which the Palestinian people are exposed is the reason behind, look at this, the reason behind this explosive situation and the absence of peace and security in the region. In other words, we're doing this, Israel, because you're an apartheid state and you left us no choice. You stole that land from an indigenous people group called the Palestinians. Now, Mark Twain, end of the 1800s, before Israel was a state again, visited the Holy Land. He wrote about it 2 years after his visit in his book called Innocents Abroad. And he says there's absolutely nothing here but a barren expanse. In fact, at one point, he ran into a goat, and he said it must be a goat that survives by eating rocks, because there's no greenery here, there's no shrubbery here. In other words, what the world wants you to believe, the world community wants you to believe, is you stole the land from some thriving indigenous group. Mark Twain says there's nobody here at all. It's a barren expanse. So Israel, when they went into that land, I'm not saying they did everything perfectly, but certainly you cannot make the argument that they're illegal occupiers. But if you keep repeating occupier over and over again, and you keep repeating apartheid state over and over again, the mindset is eventually the world will start to look at them like we looked at South Africa, an apartheid state, which at that point South Africa obviously was an apartheid state, and so world opinion shifted against South Africa. And so the idea is we've got to shift world opinion against the Jewish people. We've got to, the world has to stop feeling sorry for Israel because of the Holocaust. And we have to present Israel as the villain. The truth of the matter is, Israel has in its Knesset non-Israeli citizens. Now that's a very difficult thing for an apartheid state to do, right? The Arab population, since the rebirth of Israel in 48, since their success in 1967, since their success in 1973, the Arab population within Israel has expanded. So it's very difficult to argue that they're an apartheid genocidal power. If they are an apartheid genocidal power, then the Arab population would have shrunk, wouldn't it? Yeah. But actually it has increased. So this is an important statement that's made, and I wanted to give you a real fast analysis of this, because unless you're taught a few things, this kind of thing will catch on with the world community in terms of repetition, and you're sort of caught flat-footed in terms of how to handle the propaganda. Here is a map that they will never show you on CNN. They won't even show you this on Fox News. But those green areas represent Islamic theocracies that, based on their own charters, are committed to driving Israel into the Mediterranean Sea. That little tiny red dot represents Israel. And so what the world community wants you to believe is if Israel just gives up a little bit more territory, we're going to have peace in the region.
Yeah, right.
And how in the world could you convince the world to do something like that? You have to win, as the Soviets taught Arafat. You can't win this militarily. You've got to win this narrative war or this propaganda war. Israel is going to be just fine. The reason Israel is going to be just fine is God has a purpose for Israel, right? That's Israel's Iron Dome, God's hand around the nation of Israel. Now, when I put that up, I don't want you to think that Israel's going to have it easy.
No.
Because the prophet Zechariah chapter 13, verses 8 and 9, says this: "It will come about in all the land, declares the Lord, that 2 parts in it will be cut off and perish, but the 3rd part will be left in it. I will bring the 3rd part through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God." So yes, God is going to preserve Israel, but as she passes through the Great Tribulation period, it's not going to be an easy process. If I'm reading my Bible correctly, 2/3 of the Jewish people will perish. 2/3 will be broken off in unbelief, leaving just 1/3. And yet it's that 1/3 that God is going to take through the fire of the tribulation period, purify them, bring them to saving faith, in other words. So by the time you get to the end of the tribulation period, every Jew that's alive on planet Earth will be born again. A whole nation will be saved. And God, through that nation, will fulfill his covenants in and through them in the millennial kingdom. And so what we're sort of seeing right now on our news feeds is just sort of a precursor, dare I say, a dress rehearsal of things to come. And so I just wanted to kind of bring you up to speed on that. There is a satanic agenda to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Satan knows the prophecies, and he understands that God has covenanted to bring his kingdom to the world through Israel. He's worked in history to blot Israel out. But at the same time, God has a plan for Israel. 1/3 of them will pass through the fire, be preserved through the fire, and the millennial kingdom will begin. To the Jewish mind today, what's their saying that they use? Never again. Hitler killed 1/3.
Yeah.
If I'm understanding my Bible correctly, there is a worse form of suffering yet future, where 2/3 will be killed. Now try preaching that to a Jewish audience today and see what kind of reaction you get. They don't want anything to do with this type of eschatology, and yet that's what your Bible says. So we're caught in the middle of a spiritual war, a narrative war between good and evil, and yet God has seen fit in advance to reveal these things to us. And we're living in a unique time period. You know, we're seeing a lot of the fruit of these prophecies. So that's my prophecy update. That was 5 minutes, right, Bill?
It
You want to
was wonderful.
open up for some